Yorkshire, 1809. A crowd gathers at the foot of the gallows in York. The air is damp, heavy with anticipation. Thousands have come, farmers, mill workers, merchants, and even children, pushed forward by the irresistible urge to see the end of a woman whose very name carried dread. Mary Bateman. To her neighbors, she was no ordinary criminal. They called her the Yorkshire Witch. For years, Mary had whispered promises into desperate ears. She offered charms against curses, powders to heal sickness, potions to draw back wandering lovers. And people believed her. They had to believe her. Because in a world where medicine often failed and fate felt cruel, Mary's words sounded like hope. But hope was the mask she wore. Behind her gentle smile and quiet confidence lay something far darker. Those powders she prescribed often contained poison. Those promises of healing concealed a trail of death. Mary Bateman was not the first woman in England to be accused of witchcraft, and by her time the old witch trials were long over. But what set Mary apart was how she used the idea of witchcraft, the fear of curses, the longing for protection, as her greatest weapon. She wrapped herself in superstition, and in doing so, became untouchable. For a time. On the morning of her execution, as she mounted the scaffold, some swore she looked calm, almost serene, as if even the noose could not break her spell. But her power ended when the trapdoor fell. The Yorkshire Witch was dead. Yet her story lived on, of deception and fraud, of arsenic hidden in cures, of lives stolen under the guise of healing. A story that reminds us how fear, when exploited, can be deadlier than any curse. This is the tale of Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire Witch. Deadly deceptions in Old England. To understand Mary Bateman, we must first understand the world in which she thrived. Yorkshire in the late 18th and early 19th century was a land of contrasts. The Industrial Revolution was sweeping through its cities, Leeds, Wakefield, York, where smoke rose from mills and factories, and thousands of men, women, and children toiled for meager wages. Yet just beyond those crowded streets lay villages that seemed untouched by progress, where the rhythms of life still followed the seasons, and old beliefs clung to the people like ivy on stone. It was a world where disease was ever present. Tuberculosis, fevers, and mysterious wasting illnesses claimed lives with little warning. Medical science was rudimentary at best. Physicians bled their patients, purged them, or offered ineffective tonics. For the poor, even this unreliable medicine was often out of reach. And so, when the body failed, people turned elsewhere. For answers, for comfort, for hope. That elsewhere was superstition. Though witch trials had ended more than a century earlier, the belief in witches had never truly died. Curses, charms, and cunning folk still played a central role in rural life. A sick child might be thought bewitched. A run of bad harvests could be blamed on the evil eye. Amulets were worn to ward off harm, prayers whispered to keep the devil at bay, and when fear grew unbearable, there was always someone willing to claim they could help. For generations, Yorkshire had known its wise women and cunning men. These figures offered remedies drawn from herbs, old rituals, and whispered incantations. They were healers, fortune-tellers, spiritual guides, half respected, half feared. To some, they were saviors. To others, they lingered too close to the line of witchcraft. It was in this climate of faith and fear that Mary Bateman found her stage. The people were primed to believe. They wanted to believe that curses could be broken, that the sick could be cured, that their lives were not simply at the mercy of chance. Mary understood this longing, and she weaponized it. With her confident manner, her scraps of ritual, and her invented connections to unseen powers, she could slip easily into the role of the wise woman. And the more desperate her clients, the more control she gained. The Yorkshire Witch did not rise out of nowhere. She was the product of a world where hope was scarce, fear was plentiful, and superstition was the bridge between the two. And on that bridge, Mary Bateman began to build her empire of deception. Mary Harker, later known to the world as Mary Bateman, was born in 1768 in the small Yorkshire village of Asenby, near Thirsk. At first glance, there was little to distinguish her from the children of other farming families. Her parents were respectable, hard-working folk, living modestly but comfortably within their community. But from her earliest years, Mary showed traits that unsettled those around her. She was clever, far cleverer than most girls her age. Unlike many in rural Yorkshire, she was literate, able to read and write with ease. This skill, rare and precious at the time, would later become one of her sharpest weapons. Words, to Mary, were not just tools of communication. They were tools of persuasion, manipulation, and power. Yet alongside her intelligence came a darker reputation. As a child, Mary was caught in petty lies, small thefts, and acts of deceit that revealed a taste for trickery. A stolen trinket here, a fabricated story there. It was not enough to bring scandal, but enough for neighbors to whisper that she was a girl who could not be trusted. When she grew older, Mary left home to find work. She became a servant, then a seamstress, trades that gave her glimpses of the households of others, how they lived, what they valued, what they feared. But her employment was often short-lived. Time and again she was dismissed for dishonesty, for theft, for conduct that left her employers wary. In 1792 she married John Bateman, a wheelwright from Leeds. By all accounts, John was an honest and steady man, the kind who might have hoped for a quiet life with his new wife. But Mary was restless. Respectability did not satisfy her. She craved money, influence, and a life beyond the narrow means of a craftsman's household. It was during these years that she began to experiment more openly with deception. She sold small charms, told fortunes, and began crafting the image of herself as a woman with special powers. Where others hesitated, she was bold. She played on people's fears of curses, their longing for luck, their desperation for cures. And in a society still steeped in folklore, her words carried weight. But Mary's greatest invention was not a potion or a charm, it was a person. She created a figure she called Mrs. Moore, a mysterious and powerful woman who supposedly directed Mary's remedies and advised her clients from the shadows. Mrs. Moore never appeared in person. She existed only through Mary's carefully forged letters and second-hand commands. Whenever Mary wished to demand more money, she claimed it was at Mrs. Moore's insistence. Whenever her cures failed, the blame fell not on Mary, but on her elusive partner. It was an ingenious trick, and it worked. Mary's reputation as a cunning woman grew. She was no longer just a seamstress's daughter with a habit of lying. She was something more, a figure of fear, of authority, of secret knowledge. The petty thief from Asenby had found her stage, and soon her performance would command an audience far larger than she ever imagined. By the turn of the 19th century, Mary Bateman had fully embraced her new identity. No longer a mere servant or seamstress, she presented herself as a woman of hidden knowledge, a healer, a fortune-teller, a dealer in charms and secrets. And in a land where superstition was as real as the weather, this persona gave her extraordinary power. She began modestly. A charm here, a love potion there, paper slips inscribed with strange symbols, folded neatly and sewn into clothing to ward off curses, powders to sprinkle in food or drink, guaranteed to bring good fortune, or protection against the evil eye. She told fortunes with a steady, confident tone, never wavering in her conviction. To the poor and desperate, her words felt like truth. But Mary was not content with simple trinkets. She understood the value of authority, and she created it through her most brilliant invention, the unseen Mrs. Moore. Whenever she wished to heighten the drama of her predictions or strengthen the fear in her clients, she claimed to consult Mrs. Moore, a wise and powerful woman who supposedly communicated with spirits and unseen forces. Mary would produce letters in Mrs. Moore's handwriting, filled with ominous warnings and strict instructions. Of course, the letters were her own creations, written with a disguised hand. This device gave Mary extraordinary flexibility. If her advice seemed too harsh, she could claim she was merely passing on Mrs. Moore's command. If her clients grew suspicious, she could defer to the authority of her invisible partner. It was a masterstroke in manipulation, creating a second voice that reinforced her own. Mary's reputation grew quickly. In Leeds and surrounding villages, she became known as a woman who could solve problems that no doctor or preacher could touch. When illness struck, she offered cures. When marriages faltered, she promised reconciliation. When money disappeared, she foretold how to retrieve it. Each Each promise came at a price, and Mary never forgot to collect. The fear surrounding her was just as valuable as the trust. Clients who doubted her risked more than losing their money. They risked offending the Yorkshire Witch. And who knew what curses might follow such a betrayal? In this way, Mary ensured obedience. Her victims trapped themselves, too afraid to question, too desperate to walk away. By the early 1800s, Mary Bateman had secured a dark kind of celebrity. People spoke of her with caution, her name traveling from farmhouse to workshop, from market stall to tavern corner. To some, she was a healer. To others, a menace. But all agreed on one thing. Mary Bateman was not a woman to be crossed. She had transformed herself from a penniless thief into a figure of almost supernatural influence. But power built on deception is never stable. The more Mary took, the more she demanded, the more dangerous her game became. And soon, deception would not be enough. She would need something stronger, something deadlier. For years, Mary Bateman's schemes had been profitable, but for the most part, non-lethal. She tricked, she stole, she manipulated, but she left her victims alive. Yet deception alone could only carry her so far. To maintain the illusion of power, she needed her remedies to show results. And when fear was her currency, the line between healing and harm became dangerously thin. Mary's methods began to shift. Her powders and potions, once harmless mixtures of herbs or flour, grew more sinister. She had discovered arsenic, a poison as common as it was deadly. In an age before regulation, arsenic could be bought cheaply, often for use as rat poison. White and tasteless, it dissolved easily into food or drink. In small doses, it caused slow illness, stomach pain, weakness, wasting away. In larger amounts, it was fatal. To Mary, arsenic became the perfect tool. If a client fell ill under her care, it could be explained as the natural course of the curse or illness she claimed to be treating. Their worsening condition only confirmed that the evil forces at work were powerful enough to require more visits, more charms, more payments. And if the client died, well, that too could be explained. Perhaps the curse had been too strong. Perhaps the victim had not followed her instructions closely enough. In every outcome, Mary stood to profit. Her early uses of poison were cautious, almost experimental. Victims suffered, but often survived. They rarely suspected her, convinced instead that unseen spirits or hexes were to blame. For Mary, each episode was a lesson in how much she could control, how far she could push before suspicion fell upon her. But as the years passed, her confidence grew. The lies became easier, the doses stronger. Where once she might have hesitated, she now administered poison with calm assurance. And in doing so, she crossed the threshold from trickster to killer. Mary's charm was her mask. She spoke with such certainty, carried herself with such authority, that even those wasting away under her care clung to her words. They believed they needed her more than ever, and so they kept paying, kept obeying, even as their lives slipped away grain by grain, dose by dose. By now, Mary Bateman was more than a local cunning woman. She was a predator disguised as a healer, and while whispers about her methods began to ripple through Yorkshire, none dared to accuse her outright. Fear silenced her victims, while death erased their voices altogether. But one family's tragedy would change everything. It was through her dealings with Rebecca and William Perigo that Mary A.'s deceptions would finally unravel, and her legacy as the Yorkshire Witch would be written in blood. William and Rebecca Perigo of Bramley were a respectable couple, neither wealthy nor destitute, but like so many of their neighbors, they carried burdens that weighed heavily on their lives. Rebecca in particular was plagued by poor health, mysterious ailments that sapped her strength and filled her days with pain. In a time when doctors offered little but bleeding and bitter tonics, hope often came from outside the physician's office. And hope, in this case, arrived in the form of Mary Bateman. The Perigos had heard whispers of her talents, her connections to the unseen Mrs. Moore, her supposed ability to cure sickness and break curses. Desperate for relief, they turned to Mary, placing their trust and their lives in her hands. Mary wasted no time in weaving her spell. She told the Perigos that they were under the influence of a terrible curse. Rebecca's illness, she claimed, was not a simple matter of the body, but the work of dark forces that sought to destroy them both. To survive, they would need protection, powerful protection. And that protection, of course, could be provided through Mary and her mysterious partner, Mrs. Moore. From the start, Mary demanded strict obedience. The Perigos were to follow every instruction without question. They were to prepare special meals according to her recipe, consuming powders she provided as a remedy and safeguard. They were to deliver payments and gifts, not just in money but in food, clothing, and household goods. Offerings that would, Mary assured them, help appease the spirits and lift the curse. What the Perigos did not know was that the powders Mary supplied were laced with arsenic. Day after day, Rebecca ingested the poison, her health deteriorating with agonizing slowness. Each new symptom only seemed to confirm Mary's story. The curse, Mary warned, was strong. They must not falter now. They must continue the treatments. The cruelty of Mary Charmet's deception was not only in the poison itself, but in the way she manipulated the couple's fears. When Rebecca cried out in pain, Mary explained it was a sign the curse was being drawn out. When William hesitated in his payments, she insisted that failure to give enough would doom them both. The Perigos, trapped in a web of fear, obeyed. As the weeks dragged on, Rebecca grew weaker. Her skin grew pale, her body frail, her life slowly slipping away. Yet still Mary assured them that deliverance was close, that if they remained faithful to her instructions, the curse would soon be broken. But it never was. In 1808, after months of suffering, Rebecca Perigo died. Her husband, devastated, turned again to Mary. And even in death, she exploited him. She insisted that Rebecca's passing was not the end, but a warning, that the curse still hung over William, and only continued offerings and obedience would keep him safe. Terrified of joining his wife in the grave, William complied. For a time, Mary believed she had succeeded once more, silencing her victim and tightening her hold on the survivor. But William was not entirely broken. Grief sharpened his mind, and slowly, suspicion began to creep in. Why had Rebecca's health declined so rapidly under Mary's care? Why had the powders, supposedly remedies, only seemed to worsen her suffering? The more William reflected, the more convinced he became that Mary had deceived them, that she had not only failed to cure Rebecca, but had hastened her death. His doubts grew until they could no longer be ignored, and eventually he carried his suspicions to the authorities. It was this act of courage, this breaking of Mary's spell, that set in motion her downfall. The death of Rebecca Perigo was not the first link to Mary Bateman, but it was the one that could not be hidden, could not be explained away by curses or unseen spirits. It was the death that pulled back the veil, exposing the Yorkshire Witch for what she truly was. The death of Rebecca Perigo might have ended in silence, just another tragedy in a land already filled with grief. But William Perigo refused to let the matter rest. Where others had been cowed into obedience, William's grief hardened into determination. He had trusted Mary Bateman. He had paid her, followed her every instruction, placed his wife's very life in her hands. And now Rebecca was gone. William began to speak, first quietly, to neighbors and friends, then more openly, his words spreading through Bramley and beyond. He told anyone who would listen that Mary's powders had made Rebecca worse, not better. That Mary's talk of curses and remedies had been nothing more than a disguise for something far darker. As William's suspicions grew louder, so too did the whispers of others. For years, Mary had left a trail of broken households behind her, families who had sold their goods, emptied their savings, and surrendered their valuables to her supposed rituals. Women who had consumed her powders and fallen sick. Men who had sought her guidance and found themselves ruined. Most had stayed silent, ashamed of being deceived, or afraid that speaking against the Yorkshire Witch would bring them further harm. But William's defiance cracked the spell of fear. One by one, other voices joined the chorus. Testimonies surfaced of thefts, frauds, and mysterious deaths, all circling back to Mary Bateman. The image Mary had so carefully built, of the confident healer, the powerful intermediary to Mrs. Moore, began to crumble. Where once her name had inspired awe, it now inspired suspicion. The stories no longer portrayed her as a wise woman to be feared, but as a predator to be exposed. Even those who still clung to superstition could not ignore the mounting evidence. If Mary had been working to break curses, why had so many of her clients ended up dead, sick, or penniless? If she truly held powers beyond the ordinary, why did she always demand payment in coin, clothing, or food? For Mary, the walls were closing in. She had thrived in secrecy and whispers, but now the whispers had turned against her. And when William Perigo carried his testimony to the authorities, it gave voice to years of suspicion that had lingered in Yorkshire's shadows. The law could no longer look away. The Yorkshire Witch was about to face a reckoning, one she could not charm, deceive, or poison her way out of. When William Perigo finally brought his suspicions to the authorities, he gave them more than a complaint. He gave them a key that unlocked years of hidden crimes. For too long, Mary Bateman's reputation as the Yorkshire Witch had shielded her, her authority reinforced by fear and superstition. But William's testimony forced the law to look closely, and what they found was damning. Investigators traced Mary's dealings with the Perigos in detail. William described the powder she had provided, the strict instructions she had demanded, and the gradual, agonizing decline of his wife's health. Most crucial of all, he still possessed some of the mysterious powders Mary had given them. When analyzed, they revealed the truth: arsenic. Mary's supposed remedies had been nothing more than poison in disguise. This discovery was the turning point. It transformed rumor into evidence, suspicion into proof. But the case against Mary did not stop there. Once word spread of the investigation, others stepped forward. Families who had lost loved ones, neighbors who had suffered under Mary's supposed cures, clients who had been bled dry of money and possessions. Testimonies poured in, painting a picture of a woman who had preyed systematically upon the fears and superstitions of her community. Among the stories were claims that Mary had not only poisoned, but also stolen, persuading victims to part with money, clothing, and valuables under the pretense of ritual offerings to Mrs. Moore. Some accounts even hinted that she had used her poisons not merely to enrich herself, but to remove those who might expose her. By the autumn of 1808, Mary Bateman was arrested and held for trial at York Castle. The case quickly attracted widespread attention. Newspapers eagerly reported every detail, branding her with the chilling title of the Yorkshire Witch. To the public, she was not simply a criminal. She was a relic of darker times, a living reminder of superstition and evil cloaked in human form. The trial opened in March 1809, and the courtroom was packed. People traveled from across Yorkshire to witness the spectacle. Mary herself cut a striking figure, neither weeping nor hysterical, but composed, almost serene. Some remarked that she carried herself with the same confidence she had used to charm her victims. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented William Perigo's testimony in full, detailing the months of manipulation and the slow death of his wife. The poison powders, preserved as evidence, were brought before the court. Experts confirmed their contents: arsenic, deliberate and lethal. Witness after witness came forward, describing their dealings with Mary, their lost savings, their sudden illnesses, their belief that she had cursed or bewitched them. Piece by piece, the carefully spun web of Mary Bateman's deceptions was torn apart. Mary's defense was weak by comparison. She denied intent to kill, claiming she had only been acting as an intermediary for Mrs. Moore, that she had merely offered the remedies in good faith. But this argument only reinforced the sense that Mary was hiding behind superstition, deflecting blame onto a phantom she had created. The jury took little time to reach their verdict: guilty of murder. For Mary Bateman, the sentence was death. The announcement sent a shockwave through the packed courtroom. Outside, the news spread quickly: the Yorkshire Witch would hang. For many, it was not only justice but a symbolic cleansing, the end of a shadow that had haunted their communities for too long. Mary remained calm, almost unnervingly so, as the sentence was read. But beneath her composure, she must have known that her spell had finally broken. Her trial was over. The gallows awaited. On the morning of March 20th, 1809, the city of York awoke to a spectacle. Crowds poured into the streets, swelling toward the castle where the execution would take place. It was said that as many as 5,000 people gathered, drawn by curiosity, fear, and a hunger to see the Yorkshire Witch meet her fate. Executions in this era were grim public entertainments, but Mary Bateman's hanging was something more, a ritual cleansing, a moment of collective exorcism. For years she had haunted the imaginations of Yorkshire folk, her name spoken in whispers. Now they came to watch her power broken once and for all. Mary was led from her cell with calm composure. Dressed simply, she showed none of the hysteria that some expected. Instead, she carried herself much as she had in court, confident, collected, even defiant. To the very end, she seemed to cling to her mask of control. As she mounted the scaffold, the murmurs of the crowd hushed into tense silence. The executioner placed the noose around her neck. Some later claimed that Mary prayed quietly in her final moments. Others insisted she faced death with cold indifference. Whatever the truth, when the trapdoor opened, her body fell, and the life of Mary Bateman, the so-called Yorkshire Witch, was ended. For the people of Yorkshire, it was a moment both satisfying and unsettling. Justice had been done, yet the fascination with Mary Bateman did not die with her. In many ways, it had only begun. The woman who had traded in curses and poison had left behind one final legacy, a corpse that would not be forgotten. The death of Mary Bateman did not mark the end of her story. If anything, it only deepened the fascination surrounding her name. For the people of Yorkshire, the execution was justice, but it was also the beginning of a strange afterlife that blurred the line between history and legend. Mary's body, like many executed criminals of the time, was not buried quietly. Instead, it was claimed by the authorities for dissection, a final humiliation reserved for the worst offenders. Before crowds of onlookers, surgeons laid open her remains, transforming the woman once feared as a witch into an object of scientific curiosity. But what happened next was stranger still. Her skin was flayed and tanned, cut into small strips that were sold as charms. Buyers believed that carrying a piece of the Yorkshire Witch would protect them against evil, an irony as grotesque as it was telling. The woman who had profited from superstition in life continued to be traded as a relic in death. Her skeleton, meanwhile, was preserved and displayed at Leeds Medical School, where it remained for generations. Students studied her bones, while visitors whispered about the infamous poisoner whose remains still lingered, a grim reminder of Yorkshire's most notorious criminal. These relics of Mary Bateman, the skin, the bones, the stories that clung to her, ensured that she would not fade into obscurity. She became a figure lodged between history and folklore, both condemned as a murderer and remembered as the last great witch of England's dark superstition. Even in death, Mary Bateman held a strange power over the living. Not through curses, not through arsenic, but through memory itself. And that memory, both grotesque and captivating, would outlive her by centuries. The story of Mary Bateman, the so-called Yorkshire Witch, is more than a tale of poison and fraud. It is a window into an age when fear and superstition could shape lives as powerfully as faith or law. Mary thrived because she understood the human need for answers. In a world where illness struck without cause, where crops failed, where death was always near, people craved certainty. Doctors often failed them, priests could not always console them, but Mary offered explanations. She pointed to curses, unseen forces, and spirits that could be bargained with, if only the price was paid. It was deception, but it was also belief. Her victims did not fall simply because they were gullible. They lived in a society steeped in folklore, where charms and omens carried as much weight as science. Mary Bateman weaponized that belief, twisting hope into a trap and fear into profit. Her crimes force us to ask unsettling questions. How much of her success lay in her cunning, and how much in the willingness of others to surrender their judgment to superstition? Would her poison have been as deadly if not carried on the back of whispered fears of witches and curses? Mary's execution was supposed to mark an end, but the fascination that clung to her name, her relics sold as charms, her skeleton displayed in glass, shows that society could not fully let go. She remained a spectacle, a lesson, and perhaps a warning. In the centuries since, the figure of Mary Bateman has taken on a mythic quality. Some remember her as a con artist, others as the last of England's witches. Yet perhaps the darkest truth is simpler. She was a woman who saw weakness in others and exploited it without mercy. A thief, a liar, and ultimately a killer. And still, her story resonates. Because while the world has changed, the forces she exploited remain. Fear, desperation, the longing for control in a world of uncertainty. These are as old as humanity itself. Mary Bateman is gone. Her skin and bones have been scattered, her name etched into history. But the caution she leaves behind endures. When belief blinds reason, when fear outweighs truth, deception can take root, and death may follow close behind.